Prepare to journey back in time through dusty dictionaries and forgotten social norms to uncover the vocabulary once used for people who were not married. You might be surprised by the sheer variety and the often loaded meanings behind these words. Some terms began innocently enough, describing a person's occupation or stage in life, while others were, from their inception, designed to exert social pressure or cast judgment. We are about to explore a lexicon that reveals centuries of changing attitudes towards singlehood, reflecting economic realities, social expectations, and even legal statuses. For instance, did you know that in some historical periods, remaining unmarried could have significant financial or social repercussions, meticulously documented in legal codes and personal diaries, or that certain terms were so potent they could affect a person's standing in their community, sometimes for their entire life? Join us as we count down 12 such terms, examining their origins, their usage, and the fascinating stories they tell about how societies viewed and labeled single individuals. Number 12. Bachelor girl. The term bachelor girl emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period of significant social change, particularly for women. It specifically referred to a young, independent, unmarried woman, often one who was pursuing a career or living on her own, away from her family. This was a relatively new phenomenon, as societal norms had traditionally expected women to move from the care of their father to the care of their husband. The rise of the bachelor girl was linked to increasing educational and employment opportunities for women, particularly in burgeoning urban centers. Cities like London, New York, and Paris saw a growing population of these women. For example, in the United States, the percentage of women in the workforce increased from around 18% in 1890 to nearly 22% by 1920. Many of these working women were single. The term itself, bachelor girl, attempted to create a female equivalent to bachelor, a term long used for unmarried men. However, while bachelor often carried connotations of freedom, experience, and a certain roguish charm, bachelor girl was a more ambiguous label. On one hand, it could signify modernity, independence, and a spirit of adventure. Magazines and newspapers of the era sometimes portrayed the bachelor girl in a glamorous light, living a sophisticated urban life. The new woman ideal, popular at the turn of the 20th century, often overlapped with the image of the bachelor girl, educated, self-sufficient, and challenging traditional gender roles. These women were seen as pioneers, carving out new spaces for themselves in a male-dominated world. On the other hand, the term could also carry undertones of societal concern or disapproval. The independence of the bachelor girl could be viewed as a threat to traditional family structures. There were anxieties about her morality, her perceived rejection of marriage and motherhood, and her ability to support herself without male protection. Some contemporary commentators worried about the bachelor girl problem, fearing that these women were eschewing their natural roles. The term could imply a temporary status, a phase before eventual marriage, rather than a permanent or desired state of singlehood. The girl part of the term, as opposed to bachelor woman, also infantilized these adult women to some extent, subtly undermining their autonomy and seriousness. Publications from the early 1900s often featured articles debating the pros and cons of the bachelor girl lifestyle, reflecting society's ambivalence. For example, a 1905 article might discuss the loneliness of the bachelor girl, while another in 1910 might celebrate her freedom. The term captured a moment of transition where women's roles were expanding, but societal acceptance of female independence was still tentative and often conditional. The very existence of a special term like bachelor girl highlights how unusual and noteworthy female independence was considered at the time, compared to male singlehood, which was more normalized. Number 11. Confirmed bachelor. Term confirmed bachelor gained particular prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries, referring to a man who seemed to have made a deliberate and permanent decision to remain unmarried. Unlike a younger bachelor who might be seen as simply not yet settled, a confirmed bachelor was typically older, and society had largely given up on the expectation that he would marry. The word confirmed suggested a settled state, a resolution that was unlikely to change. This label often carried a complex mix of societal perceptions. In some contexts, a confirmed bachelor might be viewed with a degree of respect or even admiration. He could be seen as a man dedicated to his career, his intellectual pursuits, or his personal freedom. Figures in literature and public life were sometimes described this way, implying a certain sophisticated or worldly detachment from domestic concerns. He might be the eccentric uncle, the dedicated scholar, or the devoted artist, whose single status was perceived as a necessary condition for his achievements or lifestyle. There was often an assumption of financial stability, as a man choosing not to marry might be presumed to have the means to support himself comfortably without the economic unit of a family. For example, census data from the late 1800s in Western countries often showed a small but consistent percentage of men over 45 who had never married, and these individuals would often have been labeled as confirmed bachelors by their communities. However, the term confirmed bachelor could also be a euphemism or carry unspoken implications, particularly as the 20th century progressed and understanding of human sexuality evolved. In some instances, it was used to discreetly refer to men who were homosexual, at a time when same-sex relationships were heavily stigmatized and often illegal. In such cases, confirmed bachelor served as a coded term, allowing society to acknowledge a man's permanent single status without openly addressing the reasons which might have been socially unacceptable or personally dangerous. This usage is evident in biographical accounts and social commentaries from the mid-20th century, where public figures known to be gay were often described as lifelong bachelors or confirmed bachelors. Furthermore, depending on the social circle and the individual's personality, a confirmed bachelor could also be viewed with suspicion or pity. He might be seen as selfish for avoiding the responsibilities of marriage and family, or as somehow incomplete. In eras that placed a high premium on family life as the cornerstone of society, a man who deliberately opted out could be seen as an anomaly. There were whispers about why he hadn't married. Was he too picky? Too eccentric, perhaps? With a secret sorrow or a difficult temperament? The term, therefore, was not neutral. It carried layers of meaning that could shift based on context and the observer's perspective. While it offered a more defined and less transient category than simply bachelor, it still marked the individual as outside the norm of adult life, which was overwhelmingly defined by marriage. The very need to confirm his bachelorhood implied that lifelong single status for a man was something that required explanation or a definitive statement. Number 10. Maiden aunt. The term maiden aunt refers to an unmarried aunt, the sister of one of a person's parents who has never married, and by implication has no children of her own. This term became particularly common in the social lexicon of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. While seemingly a straightforward descriptive term, maiden aunt carried significant cultural baggage and often painted a specific, sometimes stereotypical, picture of the woman it described. The word maiden itself, derived from Old English maiden, meaning a virgin or unmarried young woman, when attached to aunt, highlighted her enduring unmarried status into an age where most of her peers would be married. Historically, the role of the maiden aunt within the family structure could be quite varied. In many families, especially those of the middle and upper classes, the maiden aunt often became an integral part of the extended household. She might live with her married siblings and their children, or with her aging parents. In such situations, She frequently took on domestic responsibilities, such as childcare, nursing the sick, managing household affairs, or serving as a companion. For example, Victorian literature is replete with characters of maiden aunts who dedicate their lives to their nieces and nephews. Charles Dickens' Betsy Trotwood in David Copperfield, though a formidable character, eventually provides a home and guidance for David, embodying some aspects of the caring, if eccentric, maiden aunt. The societal perception of the maiden aunt was often a mixture of appreciation and pity. Her contributions to the family could be invaluable, providing an extra pair of hands and emotional support, often without financial compensation beyond her keep. She could be a repository of family history, a confidant for the younger generation, or a source of stability. However, her unmarried status was frequently viewed as a personal misfortune or a failure to achieve the primary societal expectation for women: marriage and motherhood. This perspective could lead to her being seen as somewhat peripheral, her life defined more by her relationship to her married relatives than by her own independent identity. Financial dependency was also a common issue. Unless she came from a wealthy family or had inherited money, a maiden aunt often had limited economic opportunities, making her reliant on the goodwill of her relative. In England, for instance, the 1851 census revealed a significant number of unmarried women over the age of 45, many of whom would have fallen into this category, often living in the households of family members. The term could also carry connotations of eccentricity, fussiness, or even bitterness, presumed to stem from a life unfulfilled by marriage. This stereotype, while not universally applied, was prevalent enough to shape expectations. The spinster aunt could be depicted as meddling, overly strict, or pining for a lost love. However, there were also portrayals of maiden aunts as strong, independent-minded women who found purpose and contentment outside of marriage, perhaps by pursuing intellectual interests, charitable work, or artistic endeavors, to the extent that societal constraints allowed. The decline in the use of maiden aunt reflects broader shifts in societal views on women's roles, the decrease in multi-generational households, and the increased acceptance of singlehood as a valid life choice for women, with greater opportunities for financial and personal independence. The very specificity of the term highlights how family roles were once rigidly defined by marital status. Number 9. Lone wolf. While lone wolf is a term still in use today, its application to single people, particularly men, has historical roots and connotations that have evolved. Originally, the term literally described a wolf that lives or hunts alone, rather than in a pack. Its metaphorical application to humans refers to individuals who prefer solitude, act independently, and avoid close social connections. When applied to single men, especially in the mid-20th century onwards, it carried a certain mystique, but also potential undertones of social detachment or even danger. The lone wolf archetype for a single man often suggested self-sufficiency, rugged individualism, and a rejection of societal norms, including the expectation of marriage and family life. He was the man, on the fringes, perhaps a bit mysterious, unburdened by domestic ties, and charting his own course. This image could be romanticized, particularly in popular culture. Think of certain characters in Western films or detective novels from the 1940s and 1950s, the solitary hero who operates by his own code. This portrayal could make the lone wolf seem intriguing or even admirable in his independence. He was not necessarily lonely, but rather chose to be alone. However, the term lone wolf, when applied to a single person, could also imply an inability or unwillingness to form meaningful relationships. It could suggest someone who is emotionally unavailable, socially awkward, or even antisocial. While bachelor might imply a sociable man who simply hasn't married yet, or confirmed bachelor, a man settled in his single status, lone wolf often hinted at a more profound separateness. There was a potential for this image to slide into something more negative, suggesting someone who is not just independent but also isolated, perhaps brooding or resentful. In social contexts, a man described as a lone wolf might be viewed with a degree of caution or suspicion. Why did he keep to himself? Was he hiding something? The concern around the lone wolf figure intensified in later decades, particularly as the term became associated in media and criminology with individuals who commit violent acts alone. While this is a more modern and specific connotation, the historical roots of the term as applied to single men already contained a seed of this unease, the idea of someone operating outside the social contract, unpredictable and unaccountable to a family or community. The very nature of a wolf that separates from the pack can be due to various reasons in the animal kingdom: being an outcast, being too old, or simply preferring solitude for hunting. When transferred to humans, these nuances also transferred. A man called a lone wolf might be admired for his perceived strength and independence, or he might be subtly ostracized for his failure to integrate into the social pack. Term highlights a societal discomfort with individuals who do not conform to group norms, particularly the norm of pair bonding and family formation. It is less about the absence of a spouse and more about a perceived detachment from the community fabric. Number 8. Odd woman. The term odd woman was used particularly in the 19th century to refer to a woman who remained unmarried, often implying she was superfluous or did not fit into the conventional social structure. This label gained prominence during a period when there was a demographic imbalance in some Western societies, particularly in England, with more women of marriageable age than men. This phenomenon was sometimes referred to as the surplus women problem, a term we will discuss separately, but odd woman was a more colloquial and often pejorative way to describe these individuals. The 1851 census in Great Britain, for example, showed approximately 365,000 more women than men between the ages of 20 and 49. This demographic reality meant that statistically not all women could marry, even if they wished to. The word odd in this context meant more than just unmarried. It carried connotations of being an anomaly left over, or not part of a pair. In a society where a woman's primary role was seen as wife and mother, an odd woman was perceived as being outside this normative framework. The term could imply pity, suggesting a woman who had been unlucky in the marriage market, or it could be used with a degree of social disdain. George Gissing's 1893 novel, The Odd Women, vividly portrays the challenging lives of educated unmarried women in late Victorian England struggling for financial independence and social acceptance. The novel's title itself brought the term into wider public consciousness and highlighted the social and economic difficulties faced by these women. The odd woman often faced a precarious economic existence. Employment opportunities for middle-class women were limited, typically confined to roles like governess, teacher, or companion, which were often poorly paid and offered little security. Without a husband or a family fortune, these women could experience significant hardship. The social position of an odd woman was also ambiguous. She did not fit neatly into social gatherings designed for couples, and her presence could sometimes be seen as awkward. There was a societal narrative that often portrayed unmarried women as unfulfilled or incomplete. While some women undoubtedly chose singlehood or found contentment in it, the prevailing societal view, reflected in terms like odd woman, was that marriage was the natural and desirable state for a woman. Term odd woman masks the intense societal pressure on women to marry and the lack of recognized, valued roles for single women, especially those without independent means. It reflects a social order where individuals were primarily defined by their marital status and family connections. The very idea that a woman was odd for not being part of a couple speaks volumes about the prevailing patriarchal structures and the limited scope afforded to women's lives outside the domestic sphere. The decline in the usage of this term is linked to the gradual expansion of women's rights, educational opportunities, and career paths, which allowed women to build fulfilling lives regardless of their marital status, making the notion of an odd woman increasingly anachronistic. It's a stark reminder of a time when a woman's value was heavily tied to her relationship with a man. Number 7. Singleton. Singleton is a relatively more modern term for a single person compared to many others on this list, gaining traction primarily in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. Origins lie in card games, like whist or bridge, where a singleton refers to a hand holding only one card of a particular suit. This origin gives the term a somewhat detached, almost technical flavor, initially lacking the heavy historical or emotional baggage of terms like spinster or old maid. When applied to people, singleton generally means an individual who is unmarried or not in a serious romantic relationship, and often someone who lives alone. The rise of singleton as a popular descriptor coincided with significant social shifts. Increasing divorce rates, people marrying later in life or not at all, and a greater acceptance of living alone. For example, in the United States, the percentage of adults living alone nearly doubled from around 7% in 1960 to about 14% by 2000, and continued to rise. In the United Kingdom, similar trends were observed, with the number of one-person households growing substantially. Singleton was often used in media and popular culture, sometimes in a light-hearted or trendy way. Character Bridget Jones, from Helen Fielding's novels starting in the 1990s, famously self-identified as a singleton, and her experiences popularized the term globally. In this context, singleton could describe a lifestyle choice associated with independence, career focus, and a vibrant social life, albeit one often punctuated by the quest for a partner. It was less about a permanent state of being unmarried and more about navigating the single life in a modern urban environment. It aimed to be a more neutral and less judgmental term than older labels. However, despite its intended neutrality, singleton has not been without its critics or subtle connotations. Some argue that it can still feel somewhat clinical or diminutive, reducing an individual's identity to their relationship status. The association with a single card in a game can subtly imply incompleteness or being one of a kind in a way that is not necessarily positive, the lone card that doesn't form a pair or a set. Furthermore, while often used to describe a lifestyle that can be aspirational, independent, free, it can also be used in contexts that highlight the perceived downsides of being single, such as loneliness or the pressures of dating. The term can sometimes carry a slight air of pity or be used to denote a demographic to be marketed to, focusing on singleton consumers or singleton housing. Compared to older terms, singleton generally lacks overt negativity, does not carry the historical weight of societal disapproval, or the implication of being left over in the same way as old maid or thornback. Its usage reflects a society more accustomed to single individuals, where being unmarried is a more common and accepted part of the adult experience. Yet the very fact that a specific term is still used to denote single people, separate from the assumed norm of being coupled, indicates that marital status continues to be a significant social marker. The journey from spinster to singleton shows a clear evolution in language, but the need for such labels at all is a point of ongoing discussion. Number 6. Colebs. Colebs, often anglicized as colebs, is a Latin term meaning an unmarried person, specifically a bachelor or an unmarried man. Its usage in English, though not widespread in everyday conversation, appeared in more formal, literary, or academic contexts, particularly from the 17th century through the 19th century. The direct Latin origin lent it an air of classical learning and a certain formality. Unlike more colloquial terms, Cœlebs was less about social judgment and more a descriptive term rooted in Roman law and society, where there were sometimes legal or social disadvantages to being unmarried. For instance, the Lex Papia Poppaea, enacted in 9 AD under Emperor Augustus, included provisions that penalized unmarried and childless individuals, aiming to encourage marriage and procreation among the Roman elite. In English literature, one of the most notable uses of the term was in the title of Hannah More's popular 1809 novel, Cœlebs in Search of a Wife. This novel, a conduct book, Ka-ja didactic novel, follows the journey of a young, wealthy, and virtuous bachelor named Charles, who is looking for an equally virtuous and suitable wife according to specific Christian principles. The use of Cœlebs in the title immediately signaled to the educated readership of the time the protagonist's status as an unmarried man on a deliberate quest for marriage. The novel was immensely popular, going through numerous editions in Britain and America, and it helped to familiarize a segment of the English-speaking world with the term. Term Cœlebs itself is neutral regarding the man's age or his reasons for being unmarried, though in More's novel, the protagonist is actively seeking to change his Cœlebs status. It did not inherently carry the negative connotations of terms like old bachelor, implying cantankerousness, or the euphemistic suggestions of confirmed bachelor. Instead, it was a more objective descripti, suitable for discourses on social policy, demographics, or in narratives where the unmarried status of a male character was a key element. Because of its Latin roots, it was more likely to be used by and for an educated audience. You wouldn't typically hear it in common parlance on the street or in a village pub. It belonged more to the drawing room, the study, or the pages of a theological or philosophical treatise discussing marriage and celibacy. The relative obscurity of Cœlebs in modern English, compared to the enduring, if now outdated, bachelork, shows how language evolves. Terms with classical origins that do not fully assimilate into common usage tend to fade as educational norms change and society seeks more accessible vocabulary. Cœlebs stands as a reminder that for centuries, the state of being unmarried, particularly for men of a certain class, was a subject of serious discussion and even legal consideration, extending back to antiquity. Its formalities set it apart from more emotionally charged or socially loaded terms for single men, offering a label that was in its essence simply a statement of marital fact, albeit one with a scholarly patina. Its retirement from common usage reflects a shift away from classical terminology in everyday descriptions of social status. Number 5. Thornback. Thornback is an old and particularly unflattering term for an older unmarried woman, essentially a synonym for an old maid or spinster, but often with sharper, more negative connotations. The term dates back to at least the late 16th or early 17th century. Origin is believed to be metaphorical, possibly alluding to the thornback ray, a type of fish covered in sharp spines or thorns. This imagery suggests someone prickly, difficult, and perhaps unattractive or unapproachable, the thorns being a defense mechanism or a characteristic developed from a life perceived as unfulfilled or embittered by the lack of merit. The use of thornback was decidedly derogatory. While spinster originally had a neutral occupational meaning and old maid could sometimes evoke pity, thornback was almost invariably used with contempt or mockery, painted a picture of a woman who was not just unmarried, but also past her prime, considered undesirable, and often characterized by a sour or disagreeable temperament. This term was part of a lexicon that actively policed female behavior and appearance, penalizing women who did not conform to societal expectations of marriage and feminine agreeableness. For example, Literature from the 17th and 18th centuries sometimes features thornback characters who are caricatured as spiteful, gossipy, or meddling. A diary entry from Samuel Pepys in 1663 mentions an old thornback, clearly not as a compliment. The societal context in which thornback was used was one where a woman's value was overwhelmingly tied to her youth, beauty, and marital status. An unmarried woman beyond a certain age faced significant social stigma. Term thornback contributed to this stigma by creating a vivid and unpleasant image. It was a label that could be used to dismiss or ridicule effectively, marginalizing older single women. The implication was that such a woman had failed in the primary purpose of her existence, to secure a husband and bear children, and had, as a result, become warped or unpleasant. Economically, many women who might have been labeled thornbacks were in precarious positions. Without a husband's support, and with limited opportunities for respectable employment, older single women often faced poverty or dependence on relatives. The social scorn encapsulated in terms like thornback could exacerbate their difficulties, making it harder to find social acceptance or support. Term's power lay in its visceral imagery, the sharp, unyielding thorns. It was not just about being unmarried, it was about being perceived as unlovable and unloving. The decline and virtual disappearance of thornback from common usage is a positive linguistic development, reflecting a societal shift, however slow and incomplete, away from such overtly misogynistic labeling. It stands as a stark example of how language can be weaponized to enforce social norms and devalue individuals based on their marital status and age. The very existence of such a harsh term reveals the depth of societal anxiety and disapproval surrounding older unmarried women in previous centuries. It is a relic of a time when the failure to marry was not just a personal circumstance, but a public mark of perceived deficiency, inviting harsh judgment. Number 4. Old maid. Old maid is perhaps one of the most well-known and historically loaded terms for an unmarried woman, particularly one considered past the customary age for marriage. The term gained widespread currency from the 17th century onwards and carried significant social stigma for centuries. Unlike spinster, which had an occupational origin, old maid was, from its inception, primarily about a woman's perceived failure to marry, and the presumed negative consequences of that status. The old part emphasized that she was beyond the period of youthful eligibility and maid. While originally meaning an unmarried girl or virgin, in this context took on a pejorative sense of being left over or unwanted. The societal pressure on women to marry was immense. Marriage was often the primary path to economic security, social standing, and adult identity for women. An old maid was therefore seen as someone who had not achieved this expected milestone. This could lead to her being pitied, ridiculed, or socially marginalized. For instance, in the 18th and 19th centuries, old maids were frequent subjects of caricature in popular prints and literature. They were often depicted as eccentric, fussy, bitter, desperate for a husband, or unnaturally preoccupied with pets like cats or small dogs, which became stereotypical companions. The card game named Old Maid, where the goal is to avoid being left with the unpaired queen card, the Old Maid, further cemented the term and its negative connotations in popular culture from the 19th century. The game itself teaches children that being the old maid is undesirable. There were numerous societal beliefs and superstitions surrounding old maids. They were sometimes thought to be prone to gossip, envy, or ill temper, supposedly as a result of their unmarried state. Their advice on love or marriage might be dismissed, as they were seen as lacking experience. Economically, the life of an old maid could be challenging. Unless she had independent wealth or a supportive family, she might face financial insecurity. Many old maids became dependent on relatives, often taking on roles as unpaid housekeepers or caregivers. While some unmarried women carved out independent lives, perhaps through teaching or writing, two of the few respectable professions open to them, they often did so against considerable societal headwinds. Jane Austen, herself an unmarried woman, subtly explored the social nuances and economic realities of unmarried women of her class in her novels, though she rarely used the term old maid directly in a pejorative way about her sympathetic characters. The term old maid also reflected anxieties about female sexuality and reproduction. In a society focused on lineage and inheritance, an unmarried woman who did not produce heirs was seen as not fulfilling a key biological and social role. The term served as a social control mechanism, encouraging young women to marry by presenting the old maid as an undesirable fate. The stigma was so strong that it could affect a woman's entire life and how she was perceived by her community. While the intensity of this stigma has significantly lessened in modern Western societies, the term old maid still carries a lingering echo of these historical prejudices, which is why it is now widely considered outdated and offensive. Its retirement marks a shift towards recognizing women's value and identity beyond their marital status. Number 3. Surplus. The term surplus woman or superfluous woman gained significant traction in mid-19th century Britain and to some extent in other Western countries to describe the perceived problem of an excess number of unmarried women compared to marriageable men. This demographic imbalance was attributed to various factors, including higher male mortality rates, men emigrating to colonies in greater numbers than women, and men delaying marriage for economic reasons. For example, the 1851 census in England and Wales famously revealed that there were significantly more adult women than men, leading to widespread public discussion and anxiety about these surplus women. Figures suggested there were hundreds of thousands more women than men in the prime marriageable age groups. The term surplus itself is dehumanizing, reducing individuals to a mere statistical excess, like leftover goods. It framed these women not as individuals with their own lives and potential, but as a societal problem to be solved. Prevailing Victorian ideology held that a woman's proper place was in the home as a wife and mother. Therefore, a large number of unmarried women, the surplus, were seen as unfulfilled, potentially destitute, and a burden on society or their families. Articles and pamphlets from the period, such as William Rathbone Gregg's influential 1862 essay, "Why Are Women Redundant?" explicitly used this kind of language and argued that these women were redundant because they could not fulfill their natural destiny of marriage. Gregg's article generated considerable debate and highlighted the stark realities and societal attitudes faced by these women. The surplus woman issue prompted various proposed solutions, some more practical than others. Immigration schemes were promoted to send unmarried women to colonies like Australia or Canada, where there was a shortage of European women, with the explicit aim of finding them husbands. Efforts were also made to expand employment opportunities for middle-class women, though these were often limited to low-paid and low-status jobs, like being a governess or teacher, which were seen as extensions of domestic roles. The debate around surplus women also fueled early feminist arguments for better education and more professional avenues for women, so they would not be solely dependent on marriage for their economic and social well-being. Activists like Frances Power Cobbe wrote about the plight of unmarried women and advocated for their right to work and live independently. The psychological impact on women, labeled even implicitly as surplus, must have been considerable. To be defined by what one lacked, a husband, and to be considered an excess item in the societal inventory was profoundly disempowering. The term underscored the economic vulnerability of unmarried women and the intense societal pressure to marry regardless of personal inclination or the availability of suitable partners. While the demographic imbalance was a real phenomenon, For instance, after World War I, similar concerns about surplus women arose due to the massive loss of young men. The language used to describe it revealed deep-seated patriarchal assumptions about women's worth and purpose. The term surplus woman is now thoroughly discredited and serves as a historical reminder of how demographic facts can be filtered through societal biases to create demeaning labels. Number 2. Bachelor. The term bachelor, referring to an unmarried man, has a long and complex history, and while still used, its traditional connotations and the societal expectations surrounding it have shifted significantly, making its older applications feel outdated. The word itself has roots in Old French, bachelor, originally referring to a young man aspiring to knighthood, a novice, or a junior member of a guild or university. By the late 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer used it in the Canterbury Tales to mean an unmarried man. For centuries, bachelor was the standard relatively neutral term for a man who had not married. Historically, while single men did not face the same level of stigma as unmarried women, bachelorhood, especially if prolonged, was often viewed with a mixture of curiosity, sometimes envy, and occasionally suspicion. In many societies, marriage was seen as a marker of full adulthood and responsibility for men as well as women. A young bachelor was expected to marry eventually. If he did not, questions might arise. Was he too focused on his career? Too fond of his freedom? Unable to find a suitable wife, or perhaps, as he aged, was he considered a confirmed bachelor, with reasons spoken or unspoken for remaining single? For example, in colonial America, some settlements actually placed taxes on bachelors over a certain age, like the bachelor tax in Maryland in the 17th century, partly to encourage marriage and family formation, which was seen as vital for the growth and stability of the new colonies. Such measures, though not universally applied or always effective, indicate a societal preference for marriage. Cultural image of the bachelor has often been one of freedom, independence, and sometimes a carefree or even roguish lifestyle. The bachelor pad manoir emerged in the mid-20th century, a term for a man's apartment furnished to facilitate a lifestyle of entertaining and dating, further cementing the image of the bachelor as living a life unencumbered by domestic responsibilities. This portrayal often contrasted sharply with the typically negative stereotypes applied to unmarried women. A bachelor could be seen as playing the field, while an unmarried woman might be seen as left on the shelf. This double standard was pervasive. In literature and film, the bachelor character could range from the suave, eligible hero to the irresponsible playboy or the lonely, eccentric older man. However, the idea that bachelorhood was an entirely enviable or problem-free status is an oversimplification. Socially, bachelors could sometimes be seen as incomplete or as shirking their societal duties to marry and raise families. They might be excluded from certain social events centered around couples or families. There were also economic considerations. While a bachelor did not have the direct financial burden of supporting a wife and children, he also lacked the potential economic and domestic contributions of a spouse. As men aged, a solitary bachelor might face loneliness or lack of care, concerns that were also, of course, faced by unmarried women. The reason bachelor, in its older, more loaded sense, can be considered outdated is that societal views on marriage and singlehood have evolved. Lifelong singlehood for men is now more accepted and less remarkable. Men marry later, and the choice not to marry at all is less stigmatized. While the word bachelor itself is still used descriptively, for example, a bachelor party is still a common pre-wedding ritual. The intense societal pressure for all men to eventually marry and the specific set of assumptions that once accompanied the term, especially for older bachelors, have faded considerably. The modern single man is less likely to be defined solely by his unmarried status in the same way his historical counterparts were. The term, when used today, often feels more like a simple statement of fact rather than a complex social category laden with expectations and judgments, as it once was. Number 1. Spinster. The term spinster has one of the most fascinating and telling evolutions of any word used to describe a single person, particularly a woman. Originally, from around the 1300s, a spinster was simply a woman who spun wool or thread for a living. Spinning was a common occupation for unmarried women, as it could be done at home and provided a means of income, however modest. Thus, spinster was initially an occupational title, denoting a woman's trade, much like baker or weaver. For example, in legal documents from the 14th to the 17th centuries, spinster was often added after a woman's name, particularly if she was unmarried and of a lower social class, to indicate her status and profession. It was a neutral, descriptive term. However, over time, as spinning became less of a common independent female occupation due to industrialization, with textile production moving into factories from the late 18th century onwards, the term spinster gradually shed its occupational meaning and became increasingly associated solely with a woman's unmarried status. By the 18th and 19th centuries, spinster had largely transformed into a label for an unmarried woman, especially one considered to be beyond the usual age of marriage, an old maid. This shift in meaning coincided with growing societal anxieties about unmarried women. Connotations of spinster became progressively more negative. It began to imply not just that a woman was unmarried, but that she was unwanted, unmarriageable, or had somehow failed in her primary societal role of finding a husband and bearing children. Stereotypes associated with spinsters emerged. They were often depicted as lonely, bitter, eccentric, prudish, or meddlesome. These caricatures were prevalent in literature, social commentary, and popular culture. For instance, a woman reaching her late 20s or early 30s without marrying in the 19th century might find herself referred to as a spinster, with all the negative baggage the term had acquired. The legal use of spinster persisted for a surprisingly long time to denote an unmarried woman in official documents, such as marriage certificates or census records, even into the 20th century in some jurisdictions. In England and Wales, spinster was formally used on marriage certificates to describe a never-married bride until it was replaced by single in 2005 after a campaign arguing the term was discriminatory and insulting. This change officially occurred as part of the Civil Partnership Act 2004. The journey of spinster from a respectable term of employment to a derogatory label for unmarried women reflects changing economic realities and enduring patriarchal attitudes. As women's economic independence through traditional crafts like spinning diminished, and if they did not marry, their social standing became more precarious, the term became a tool to reinforce the idea that a woman's primary value lay in marriage. The reclamation or rejection of the term spinster by some modern women is a separate, more recent phenomenon, but its historical weight is undeniably heavy. Its retirement from official use and its general decline in polite conversation mark a significant, though perhaps overdue, acknowledgement of the dignity and worth of unmarried women, independent of their marital status or past occupational roles. It is a powerful example of how a word's meaning can be entirely reshaped by societal change and prejudice.